So, we all know that there's been a lot of speculation that possibly more than one weapon was used because of some things that Kaylee's dad said about the wounds not matching. And then we also heard that some of them had large gaping wounds or gouges. And so it has a lot of people going, well, that doesn't sound like a K-bar could do that. Or that sounds like if the wounds don't match, that it was more than one perpetrator with different weapons. But one knife, one perpetrator can inflict a very different looking wounds. There's numerous reasons for that. So I wanted to go into some of the reasons why knife wounds can look different, and also like basically forensic characteristics of knife wounds and what forensic analysts are looking for. So let's get started. So I wanted to start with this article out of the United Kingdom. It was from Liverpool Hospital. It talks about characteristics of stab wounds. And it says stab wounds are incised wounds where the length of injury on the surface is less than the depth of penetration into the body and are the result of a thrusting action where the force is delivered along the long axis of a narrow pointed object. The force of impact is concentrated at the tip of the implement, and the sharper the tip, the easier it will penetrate the skin. Now, this talks about characteristics like clean-cut edges. One or both ends can be pointed. Non-pointed end may be squared off or split, fishtail or boat-shaped. Often gape, that's related to skin elasticity and Langer's lines. Cross-section of weapon may be illustrated when edges of wounds opposed. Underlying bone may be scored by a blade. Abrasions may be present, and frequently shows a notching or change in direction caused by relative movement of the knife and body. So the next section is assessing stab wounds and wound dimensions. So it says stab wounds are said by some authors to gape open depending on their anatomical location. Now, we've heard about gaping wounds in the Idaho case. So this goes on to talk about the Langer's lines, and what those are is from Carl Langer. And in 1861, he published his findings about wounds that go along the cleavage lines. Now, cleavage lines are like your muscle, the tendons, and the collagen lines, the collagen fibers in the skin. So when you cut across those lines, the wounds gape. And when you cut with those lines, they do not gape. So you can see how if somebody's stabbing a person at a different angle than another victim, you might have gaping wounds, whereas the other victim might not have gaping wounds. Or on the same body, you might have gaping wounds and not gaping wounds. It all depends on how the perpetrator is stabbing them, what angle they're at, is the victim laying down, is the victim standing up, etc. And it says solid organs, such as the liver, may retain the characteristics of a knife causing a wound, because it's saying it can be fraught with inaccuracies trying to measure the dimensions of the knife because of skin elasticity shrinking. So it's interesting. I thought that part was interesting because they would be able to tell by the organ what type of knife. And I'm not, going to read through every single one of these paragraphs. You can pause and read if you want to read all of these, but it says a knife that has not fully entered the skin will only produce the wound of a size corresponding to that part of the blade that is penetrated. This will not necessarily represent the maximum dimensions of the knife, and any interpretation of knife wounds must take this into account. Where there are several wounds, measurements taken from each wound would go some way towards building up the composite picture of the true dimensions of the weapon. So these would be things that the medical examiner would be looking at during autopsy. It says assessing stab wounds, type of weapon. It shows a Soviet military knife. It says knives with single cutting edges, such as kitchen knives, cause wounds that have a clearly pointed edge, with the opposite edge being squared off, a boat-shaped defect or split, often termed a fishtail. One of the authors of a study believes that fishtailing to be artifactual and has demonstrated experimentally that these marks can be reproduced by rocking the blade within the wound. So if the person's stabbing and then, rocking it back and forth, so it could create a different look, even though the weapon may not be one that might create that. Now, they talked about whether a knife is serrated or not. And it says serration markings can sometimes be made out where a knife has been drawn over the skin's surface, for example, at the termination of the wound. In practice, this finding is not at all a constant feature of wounds made by serrated knives. They are usually indistinguishable from wounds caused by other single-edged knives. And I kind of wondered about that because I know on one of the K-bar warrants, they did have a model number for one of the K-bars that was serrated. And I thought that was interesting because I wondered if they could tell the difference between a serrated wound or not. So it sounds like most of the time it's indistinguishable. Now, this section talks about when the knife enters the skin at a shallow angle, the saw edge comes into contact with the skin, giving rise to excoriated slashes, and a V shape can be made where the knife is partially removed and moved within the wound. This relative movement occurs often in knife attacks, which are dynamic, and the victim and the attacker and the knife may move relative to each other at any stage of the attack, giving rise to difficulties in interpretation and reconstruction of the events leading to the wounds under investigation. So I thought that was interesting also. So if you had a victim that is more passive, like they're out cold, those wounds are going to look different than somebody that's actively trying to defend themselves. Now, this section talks about the guards, the hilts on the knives. And you know how, like, the K-bar has the hilt? It says that these can produce distinctive bruising at one edge of the wound where the guard has impacted against the skin, particularly where the skin is supported, such as on the chest wall. It says such hilt marks, however, are uncommon, and a study done in 1991 only identified them in 3% of cases. Now, this was a UK study, and I don't know how many K-bars are in the United Kingdom or that style of military knife. It says knife guards are also sometimes in surprising places on the opposite side of a knife than would be expected. And it says bruising may also be present where the assailant's fist impacts against the skin during stabbing. Now, I remember Xana's dad said that he was told that she had a lot of bruising. So she had defensive wounds, but she also had bruises. And I'm wondering if it was from the guard on the K-bar and then also the perpetrator's fist, kind of as he pushed that knife down. It says wounds caused by other implements such as screwdrivers and chisels may have abraded edges. So this goes on to talk about those. And this is, again, how a medical examiner would differentiate what the weapon is. Ice picks, for example. So we know after the medical examiner did the autopsies that they said it was a stabbing with a large blade knife. And then it says factors to be assessed regarding the type of weapon involved in sharp force trauma. So length, width, and thickness of the blade, single or double-edged, degree of taper from tip to hilt, nature of the back edge, e.g. serrated or squared off, face of hilt guard, any grooving, serration, or forking of the blade, and sharpness of edge and extreme tip of edge. It says assessing stab wounds, movement of the knife in the wound. Knives are rarely pushed into the body and would drawn at exactly the same angle unless the victim is incapacitated at the time of the assault. In addition, both the assailant and the victim are in a highly charged state during an altercation, and movements of the principal parties are therefore highly fluid. Knife wounds reflect this dynamic situation and are often V-shaped or irregular, also referred to as twisting cuts. Rocking movements of the knife during an assault distorts the appearances of the wound, and the resultant defect is often much larger than the wound would otherwise have been created by the same knife in a more static situation. So, like how it's believed that Maddie and Kaylee were asleep and that Maddie definitely was caught off guard, her wounds could look completely different than Kaylee's if Kaylee started waking up partway through the attack. Because once you start getting movement from the victim, trying to kind of push off that attacker, the wounds start looking irregular. So then this talks about the depth of thrust. The clinician is interested in the depth of injury in order to assess which deeper structures may be at risk. So it says compressible body parts such as the chest wall or abdomen can indent during a knife attack. Structures deep within that area can be damaged at a depth that at first indication seems to be beyond the reach of the suspect weapon. Estimations of depth of thrust may be further complicated when it is considered that blades with back edges that are sharpened for a few millimeters will cause spindle-shaped incisions when the knife is only introduced superficially, but when thrust deeper, it gives rise to a wound with a squared edge typical of a single-edged weapon. Depth of penetration estimations are therefore difficult to make and may be only confirmed at autopsy or during surgical dissection. So, that's another thing the medical examiner would have been looking at. So the depth. How deep was that knife able to go in, but also knowing that it can look like it was in deeper than where it was, depending on the body part. Reconstruction of knife attacks attempts to assess the relative positions of the assailant to the victim, and the characteristics of the surface wounds may assist in determining the angle of impact. For example, the edges of one side of the wound may be undercut or shelved when a knife enters the skin at an angle. And this is what I've been talking about. The angle that the assailant is when he's stabbing the victim and the angle the victim's at. You had 4 different victims, so that doesn't mean 4 different assailants if their wounds were at different angles. That just means they were at different angles. So then the assailant had to stab them from a different angle, if that makes sense. And like, I tend to think Xana was standing when he first stabbed her because she was wide awake. My personal opinion is the other 3 were in bed, but you know, we won't know that 100% for sure. But so I believe 3 of the 4 of them would have been lying down and not providing a whole lot of resistance. Maddie, for sure, I don't believe was providing resistance. So the reconstruction is going to assess all that. It says if a knife is passing from below the umbilicus towards the nipple, for example, the subcutaneous tissue may be visible at the inferior surface and not the superior. So just the different ways the wounds look and the different organs and parts of the body that skin was going a certain way are going to show what angles everybody was at. And you can pause and read the rest of this page. And then this is just more of that, talking about the research on different angle and then energy of penetration. And they're talking about cheap kitchen knives can easily break with minimal force, and when such a knife tip strikes the bone, the tip may break off, remain embedded in the bone. So x-rays of knife wounds and surrounding body parts are helpful in finding foreign bodies. And then the article talks about biomechanical factors that can be assessed in sharp force injuries. The properties of the knife, movement of the knife up to the point of impact, affected by the clothing and movement of the victim with respect to the assailant, and from the skin to its termination within the body, the speed and direction of delivery of the blow, intrinsic properties of the knife, shape, sharpness, weight, delivery of the blow, velocity, type of thrust, and follow through, overarm or underarm, movement of the knife within the body affected by the skin, organ resistance, and movement of the victim and whether bone has been impacted. And you see how it says biomechanical factors that can be assessed in sharp force injuries. Remember how it talked about how Ethan had sharp force injuries? Okay, that is stabbing. That's stab wounds. I know people were trying to say that they didn't believe he got stabbed because it said sharp force, and that's where some thought the golf clubs came into play. But it's a stabbing. Okay. The golf clubs would not do sharp force injuries. That would be a blunt force. And then this just all talks about what I've been saying. Movement, angles, speed, direction, how the perpetrator was holding the knife, the movement of the knife, etc. So I hope me going over that article wasn't too long or boring. I just wanted to hit on some of the key points in there because it's what I've been saying all along, is one perpetrator with one weapon can cause wounds that look different on the same victim or from victim to victim. And it all depends on body position, force that was being used, sharpness of the knife, etc. And let's just look at a few other things that I found about whether one knife can produce different types of wounds. Okay, so I normally don't use ChatGPT because I don't trust it a lot of times, but I did ask it, can a single knife create different types of wounds? And it says yes, depending on various factors such as the blade's shape, size, sharpness, the force used, and the angle of the cut. Here are some examples of different wound types a knife can cause. So you have incised wounds, cuts. These are clean, straight cuts, often caused by a sharp blade. The length of the wound is greater than the depth, and the edges are usually smooth and well defined. Stab wounds. A stab wound is typically deep and narrow, created when a knife is thrust into the body, often resulting in damage to internal organs or tissues. The depth of the wound is greater than its length. Lacerations. If a knife is not very sharp or if it is used with uneven force, it can cause jagged or regular wounds. These are more commonly seen with blunt or dull knives. Puncture wounds. When a knife is thrust into soft tissue but doesn't penetrate deeply, it causes puncture wounds, which are typically round and can introduce a risk of infection. Slash wounds. A slash wound occurs when a knife is drawn or swiped across the skin, creating longer curved cuts. These can vary in depth and severity depending on the motion used. So you can see ChatGPT just basically reiterated what I read in that article. It's talking about the motion, the angles, the depth of the wound, the sharpness of the knife. And that's the other thing. If the knife was very sharp when he started stabbing, as he went along, if it started getting duller, by the time he got to the last victim, the wounds could have looked different as well. And then I did ask ChatGPT if a K-bar could make gouges, because I heard one of the content creators last week swearing that there's no way that a K-bar could produce any sort of wound that was a big gouge or a gaping wound. So let's see what ChatGPT said. So ChatGPT told me, yes, a K-bar, depending on its design and how it's used, could cause gouges. Gouges are deep, broad indentations or tears in the tissue, often with a curved or scoop shape. This type of wound typically results from a sharp, hard blade being applied with force or at a particular angle. K-bar knife with its robust blade and design, often a heavy fixed blade combat or utility knife, is capable of inflicting a gouge-like wounds, especially if used in a slashing or thrusting motion that digs into the skin and underlying tissue. The thick, strong blade of a K-bar can also leave a deeper, more pronounced cut than thinner knives, especially if it's used in a way that focuses force on a specific area. It says, however, the likelihood of a gouge occurring also depends on factors like blade sharpness. A sharp blade might create a cleaner cut, but if applied with force at the wrong angle, it could still gouge. Angle of impact, a sharp angle or slashing motion can more easily result in a gouge. And force and pressure. Applying more force or pressure will increase the chances of creating deeper indentations or gouges. Okay, and then, not to be too redundant, I'm going to read off just one more list of how they assess knife wounds, and then I'm going to call it a night. So, like usual, if you have anything else you want me to cover, let me know, and thank you, and you can watch for this last part. Okay, what is the length of the wound? This does not necessarily correspond to the width of the blade. Skin stretches as it is cut, so the wound will usually retract to a length that is shorter than the full width of the blade. Is the item sharp on one side or both? This can usually be determined by the appearance of the wound. A linear wound with two sharp ends is generally a two-sided knife. A wound with one flat end and one sharp end is usually from a one-sided weapon. The picture below shows a knife wound with one sharp side. Well, I don't have the picture. I cut that off. Is there a hilt mark? This can usually be detected by looking for bruising around the wound. The picture below shows a knife wound with a hilt mark. Again, didn't show the picture. What is the angle? If both edges are symmetric, the knife went straight in. If one surface has a tangential appearance, tangential appearance, excuse me, then the knife was angled toward that side. You can approximate the direction of entry by looking at the tangential surface of the wound edge. In this example, the blade is angling upward towards the right. How deep did it go? You have no way of knowing unless you have a blood-stained blade in your possession. And yes, it is possible for the wound to go deeper than the length of the knife, since the abdominal wall or other soft tissues can be pushed inwards during the stab.